So I just sit there uncomfortably.
Well, folks are wearing some great earrings.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh. I don't get that option.
Me neither. Yeah. I'm not really confused.
Okay.
Oh, there it went.
Oh, fancy.
And in that top left box, is that where the main program is going to be going on? Are we going to be able to see, or no, we'll just be able to see ourselves right here? It's okay. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, thanks. Okay, great, thanks. And just so the folks here know, there's going to be a YWCA video and then some slides and a video, and then we'll start with the intro. I'm not sure if we'll be able to see Ernst and Macbeth's remarks, but they're lovely and altogether about 5-6 minutes worth of remarks between the two of them. So great.
Andy and DI.
Yes.
Okay.
YWCA is the largest network of domestic and sexual violence service providers in the nation. In a typical year, more than 150 YWCAs across 44 states provide gender-based violence services. Every year, in communities big and small, YWCAs get up and do the work of providing safe and secure housing, crisis hotlines, counseling, court assistance, and other community and safety programs to more than 535,000 women, children, and families. YWCA is creating a safer, more just world by offering emergency, transitional, and long-term housing, crisis hotlines, medical and legal advocacy, and other services to survivors of domestic and sexual violence so survivors can regain stability as they rebuild their lives. Here at the YWCA, we recognize the problem and help those who are suffering in silence, because not all violence is acknowledged or responded to equally, especially for women of color, and some victims go completely unrecognized.
We know that trauma can be very isolating, and it often changes the way that families live their daily lives.
Walked through the doors and the YWCA, they provided everything that we needed.
I am moved with gratitude for our staff and community for the ways that you have continued to show up with compassion and support for women and their children.
I looked at my daughter and I said, let me tell you something. Leave that fool alone. My daughter was killed within 2 weeks later. I came up with journals and pens for the COVID Carly's cause. For the last 4 years, we have now given 165 journals and pens to the domestic violence shelters.
At YWCA, we imagine a world without violence and strive to create a world in which all women, girls, and people of color are free from racism and sexism and can thrive. Together, we can build a path to creating that world, a world where women and families are healing and accessing justice. A better future is just over the horizon, where victims of domestic violence go from surviving to thriving. Learn more on how you can support our mission at YWCA.org.
Financial planning is a complicated, lifelong process, but for domestic violence survivors, the journey to take control of their financial freedom can be even harder. That's why YWCA, in partnership with the Allstate Foundation, is using the Moving Ahead curriculum to help survivors achieve the financial freedom they need to build thriving futures for themselves and their families. The Moving Ahead curriculum is a free educational resource designed specifically to help survivors of domestic violence achieve financial independence. With the Moving Ahead curriculum, YWCA has helped thousands of survivors learn how to budget, manage debt, and improve their credit, opening up worlds of opportunity. The Moving Ahead curriculum has already done wonders for real-life survivors of domestic violence, helping them move from short-term survival to long-term security. 38-year-old single mom from Kauai, Hawaii, has gone from surviving to thriving with help from her local YWCA.
Hi, my name is Crystal Brown, and I am 38 years old. I'm a single mom to my son, who's going to be 16 in 4 days. We just relocated to Eleele in our brand new home, and I'm a proud YU graduate. And there is when I heard some amazing women speak about programs available in the community. And I met Margie, and she taught us all about creating a budget and knowing where every dollar goes, and, you know, reading a credit report, getting a credit report, and paying down your credit card bills. And with her help, I was able to raise my credit score, and I qualified for a USDA loan. That's how I was able to pay for my house.
And at YWCA Central Virginia, Lisa, a single mom, was able to use the Moving Ahead curriculum to better not only her life, but her daughter's too. Lisa was worn out, working 3 part-time jobs and barely able to save. But after YWCA worked with her on her budgeting skills, credit score, and resume, Lisa secured full-time employment with benefits. The program really works. The Moving Ahead curriculum is completely free to survivors, online, and self-paced. It can be accessed wherever you have an internet connection. Lesson plans include understanding financial abuse, learning the fundamentals of finance, improving your credit score, and planning for the future. YWCA and the Allstate Foundation can help survivors do more than just survive. We can help them thrive. Learn more about the curriculum at ywca.org.
Good afternoon and welcome to YWCA USA's virtual town hall event, part of our annual Week Without Violence campaign, which is part of a global movement with YWCAs across the country and around the world to end violence against women and girls. At YWCA, we know that not all violence is acknowledged or responded to equally, and that some victims go unrecognized altogether. And that's why for more than 20 years, YWCA has set aside 1 week in October as a week without violence, a time when we hold events, share information and stories, advocate, and more with a common goal in mind. Together, we can end gender-based violence. And today, as part of our annual Week Without Violence, we are focusing in on the topic of survivor resilience. Too often, survivors of domestic and gender-based violence are burdened by a focus on individual endurance through multiple and overwhelming sources of adversity. During this year's campaign, we intend to flip that script by moving the conversation about gender-based violence past an exclusive focus on survivors' endurance. We are highlighting actually here today how important it is to reimagine the role of resilience for survivors of domestic and sexual violence by centering healing, including replenishment, rest, and recovery, And by addressing root causes of trauma and systemic violence, we can disrupt the cycle of harm and open pathways for survivors to build thriving futures for themselves and their families. As many of you may know, supporting survivors, holding perpetrators accountable, and preventing gender-based violence is central to our work here at YWCA. And there are currently 2 critically important bills pending before Congress right now, the Violence Against Women Act and the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. And because those 2 critical bills are pending in Congress right now, we are incredibly pleased to be joined by 2 legislators who are involved in the reauthorization of these important bills. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa.
Hello, everyone. This is Senator Joni Ernst, junior senator from the great state of Iowa. While I'm sorry I can't be with you all in person today, I'm honored to share a few words as part of today's virtual town hall during this year's Week Without Violence. As many of you may know, I'm a survivor, and like too many women across our country, I know firsthand the sense of loss that comes when someone you trust abuses you. That's why I have been passionate and focused on not only supporting fellow survivors, but taking action to ensure they have the resources and help they need and that abusers are held accountable. One of my priorities is reauthorizing and modernizing the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. As some of you know, this law provides desperately needed resources to tackle domestic and sexual abuse in our communities. In Congress, I'm working hard with both Democrats and Republicans on a bipartisan bill that would not only reauthorize VAWA, but truly modernize it so that we are preventing these horrific crimes from happening in the first place. In addition, as a combat veteran, I am also working hard to address the serious issue of sexual assault in our nation's military. Sexual assault has no place in our armed forces or anywhere else, and it's far past time we take vital steps toward preventing and reducing these heart-wrenching crimes. I'm partnering with my friend and colleague, Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, on bipartisan legislation to bolster prevention programs, education, and training, improve how we hold perpetrators accountable, and equip military prosecutors with the skills necessary to handle sexual and domestic violence cases. The bottom line is we must ensure all service members are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. This week's theme is moving beyond resilience and helping women to not just survive, but to thrive. That is an incredibly important message for all survivors to embrace, and I'm pleased it's one you all are focused on today. You don't have to be a survivor to understand just how awful violence against women can be in terms of physical and mental well-being, in terms of self-image, in terms of our families, and in terms of the security of our society as a whole. That's why your work is so important. It's why events like this one are so important. You are making the difference in raising awareness of domestic violence and sexual assault and taking action to prevent it. Thank you for everything you do. Please be sure to engage in today's virtual town hall and to keep up the incredibly important work. Thank you and take care.
Thank you so much, Senator Ernst, for all that you're doing to advance this important legislation around gender-based violence. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Representative Lucy McBath from Georgia.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucy McBath, and I want to thank the YWCA for having me this afternoon. And I want to thank all of you for joining me and for being part of this network of survivors, this network of thrivers, and this network of women who continue to overcome. The last year and a half has seen grief for many, financial difficulty for millions, and the loss of the world that we once knew for every single American. A rise in our time spent at home has led to a heartbreaking increase in domestic violence across America. The anguish of far too many survivors of domestic violence during this crisis has been a painful an unshakable reminder about our fundamental need to put an end to it. The House is set to pass the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act, a long overdue reauthorization of the nation's oldest law providing federal funding for survivors of domestic violence. It funds shelters, state domestic violence coalitions, a national domestic violence hotline, and national resource centers. It helps provide survivors a way up, a way out, and a way forward. And I know there's no going back for survivors, that the trauma and tragedy of what you experienced cannot be undone. When I lost my son Jordan, there was nothing in this world that could stitch my wounds or heal my heart. There was no going back. There was only moving forward. And yes, resilience is a part of it, but love and support are also just as critical. Having a place to go, a person to talk to, and a loved one to listen to are all very, very critical. We cannot move forward unless we give ourselves time to heal. So as we recognize a week without violence, and as we continue to fight for a world in which we can make those words ring true, remember to rest and recover and to care for yourselves, because you are loved, you are cherished, and you are not alone. One of the most important things that we can do for ourselves is to practice some self-love and self-compassion. So give yourself some grace today. You've most certainly earned it. Celebrate yourselves. Celebrate all that makes you you. And celebrate with us this week as we vote to pass this vital FIPSA funding. Without your support and the dedication of groups like the YWCA, we would not be where we are today. Thank you again for letting me share my story with you. I believe we all have important stories to tell, and I can't wait to hear yours. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you so much, Representative McBath. I want to welcome each and every single one of you again today to this very, very special town hall. This is, as you've heard, our Week Without Violence, our week, and we are so honored that you are here with us, not only as we think about what the solutions are to end gender-based violence, but also to make space for survivors and to figure out how we can best support survivors. I think that something that is really important to me at the onset of this is when I say how we help survivors and how we support survivors, it sounds very distant and removed. And I want to acknowledge that many of us doing the work that we do are also survivors, including myself. So as we think about how we can support the communities that we serve, it's also really important to center how we can support each other. This is hard work, and it is challenging work, but it is work that we need to do because there is no way that our communities will go from surviving to thriving if we do not address, unfortunately, gender-based violence and the impact it has on our communities. So with that, I just want to welcome you again and just introduce India Irie, who is our special performer for today. When we were thinking about not only having a town hall to talk about the issue, to raise awareness on the issue, and to talk about how we can support survivors, it was really important to us and really important to me that we added something else that was even more meaningful to survive in some communities, which is the arts. Many of us use the arts on a daily basis to survive, whether we're listening to music, whether we're writing, whether we're drawing. It is a key tool for so many survivors on how we find energy and inspiration. So bringing that into this space is something that we wanted to accomplish. And there is absolutely no better talent that we could think of than India Irie. She certainly is a person that is on my constant replay. Definitely a person that has and continues to get me through some of the most challenging days, even this morning. So I hope that you enjoy this really brief musical contribution by India Irie, and just know that with every song selected, that we were deeply intentional in her being here and what she brings to the table as an artist.
Greetings to all. I am India Irie, and it is truly my pleasure, my honor to be here with the YWCA and all of you tonight as we observe Week Without Violence, to raise awareness of violence against girls, women, and people of color, and to collaborate on ways to support survivors as we move beyond resilience and seek new paths to a world that is free of violence. And yes, I said we, because I am a girl and a woman of color who also grew up in a domestic violence situation, who also survived a lot of things. And that is what you hear in my music. And that's why I said it is a pleasure and an honor to be here with you this evening, because the YWCA was very clear about the songs they wanted me to sing for you tonight. And that means a lot to me, because my songs are about my life, and every single word and every single song is intentional. And so to sing these songs to you tonight that are about resilience and the elevation of humanity and the acceptance of our struggles and our pain is the mission I chose in life. And really, I would say the mission chose me, because I am a survivor of a lot of things. And so as a person who seeks to be honest in my art, those things are always present. There is an ever-present theme of self-love through all of my songs, because this world will tell us that we are not worthy, that we should doubt ourselves in myriad of ways. Magazines, social media, beauty standards, and then put all that aside, and then we have all the stuff that happens in our homes, our abuses, our struggles, our stuff with our parents or our caretakers or our children or parenting or whatever it is. We all have stuff, and this life will tell us that that stuff makes us unworthy. But I'm here to tell you, not only in word but in song, that those things make us human. Sadly, it's so common that it is simply human. And so I want you to listen to the words of these songs, because I'm singing to you, about you, for you, to about for me. And I'm singing two songs for you tonight. The first one is called Worthy, because you are worthy and significant, and you matter because you exist. Da, 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 da. I know exactly what you're thinking. I've had those thoughts a million times. I can see the question that's behind your eyes, or you're searching for your peace of mind. Now listen up to this truth. You are me and I am you. Every one of us is worthy. Baby girl, worthy woman. Every one of us is worthy. Baby girl, worthy woman, every one of us is worthy. I know your life, I felt your pain. I know your joys and your shames. Sometimes it feels like life walks over you, like you're a penny on the ground. But either on the ground or in your purse, the smallest piece still holds its worth. Every one of us is worthy. Baby girl, worthy woman, every one of us is worthy. Baby girl, worthy woman, every one of us is worthy. Worthy of love, worthy of life, worthy of saying no when something don't feel right. This is my song for you, for all the ups and downs that life will put us through. Oh, so listen up to this truth. You are me and I am you. Every one of us is worthy. Yeah, baby girl, worthy woman, every one of us is worthy. Baby girl, worthy woman, every one of us is worthy. Y'all know it. Baby girl, worthy woman, every one of us is worthy. Sing it to yourself. Baby girl, worthy woman, every one of us is worthy.
Deep breaths, Alicia, deep breaths. Thank you, India Ari, for just blessing us with your talents. And even though I listen to that song maybe once a day in this moment in time, it still is getting at my emotions because it's so true. We are all worthy in our own individual and very special way, but we are part of a society that perpetuates a significant amount of barriers that chips away at our worthiness every day, particularly if you are a woman of color. So being constantly reminded of my worthiness is something that I had to be really intentional about as I grow and as I try to seek what peace looked like and what happiness looks like for me. So I hope that with those words that India Ari just shared with us, that we all feel a sense of worthiness and worthy to the extent that we can continue to show up like we do every day for each other and for the communities that we serve. So without any prolonged delay anymore, I am so excited to introduce the panel of amazing speakers and thought leaders that we have today with us. Venetia Crawford, who is the founder and CEO of BYE, Olivia Garcia, who is the public policy and training manager of Esperanza United, Monica Kant, who is the executive director of the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, Ayana Wallace, who is the training manager at JIMA Incorporated, and Carol Washar, Dr. Carol Washar, who is the director of the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. So welcome to my esteemed panelists. It is an absolute honor to be just in community, even though it's virtual, with so many of you. I am going to get right in because I know that there is a packed and full agenda, and we'll just continue to ask our panelists to keep the responses to 4 to 5 minutes. In the first round, there are 2 rounds today, and we want to make sure that we make space for all of the great information that you are all going to share with us on not only how do we actually move forward in our fight to end domestic and gender-based violence, but how do we also center survivors in a way that they know that they're human and we know that we are cared for, and there is not shame. to our experiences. So I'll start with resiliency, which is the topic of our Week Without Violence. How do we reimagine resiliency? I was on a live yesterday as part of our Week Without Violence activities, and a resiliency came up, and I point blank said, I'm certainly tired of being resilient or having to be resilient. And while I think that resiliency is important and resiliency is needed, I think that where we go wrong as a society is asking survivors and people of color to continue to show up in this notion of resiliency 24 hours a day. So when do you take that resiliency off so you can just be, right? Like, how do you drop the armor that we call resiliency and we wear as a badge of honor to actually just breathe and just be, right? So I'll start with Venetia to get us started. And instead of us giving survivors the time, space, and resources that they need to heal after the trauma that they experience in their gender-based violence situations, we expect them to be resilient. What is your thoughts on resiliency and how the society focus and praise individual resiliency hinders survivors their ability to heal from the trauma? Venetia?
Well, first, I just want to say it's an absolute honor to be a part of today's event. And I'm just moved by India Irie and her performance. And so just thank you for this opportunity to share space with everyone on this screen. But, you know, I remember when I was first introduced to this idea of resilience, and it was, you know, by people that don't look like me. And I immediately was like, what can you tell me about resilience, right? Like who I am and my people, my culture, generations beyond, we are the most resilient people in the world, right? But as I began to really dive deep into what resilience is not just pushing through or overcoming hard things. I think we have been resilient in the mind, but not necessarily resilient in the body. And so although we can navigate our ways through these really challenging situations, our life expectancy is still 20 years shorter than our counterparts. And it's because we are still having to deal with so much in our bodies, right? And so resilience is not an individual thing. Resilience is all about connectivity. It's about connection. It's about community. Resilience is actually adapting well in the face of adversity, not just barely scraping through it, right? And so the key words there is adapting well in the face of adversity. So how are we able to overcome and get through things while also still being well, mind, body, spirit, and soul? And I always am challenged with this question: are you able to heal if you are still experiencing the trauma? Is that even possible? And I know for domestic violence survivors, those of us who have survived that, it's impossible for us to heal while we still experience it. And so resilience is really about who is it that we need to connect with, like the YWCA, to kind of really get through this thing. Individual resilience is not, you are not supposed to be resilient alone. And so I'll give you a quick example of how resilience of the difference between resilience of the mind and resilience of the body. My grandfather, during his last years of life, I just watched him in the hospital, in and out of the hospital. His body is frail, weak, so fragile, but his mind was so sharp. He could remember what my grandmother wore 50 years ago, the very first day they met. So while his mind was sharp and his mind was resilient, his body lays there frail because it had been put through so much. So when we say we want you to be resilient, it is not be resilient through abuse. It's be resilient through the fight of life. There is no escaping hard things in life. That's just what comes with it. Life is hard. Abuse is not that, right? But we want you to, as much as you possibly can, live through life. That's what we want you to be resilient through, not resilient through the abuse and the trauma that you're experiencing that's caused by others. And so I'll end with individual resilience is just one part of it. Those of us who work in these systems and these large organizations and sectors and government agencies, we have a responsibility to build community resilience because individual people can't do it alone. And so that means we have to step outside of our sector, step outside of our silo, and we need to get into the business of everybody else's business so we can figure out how to serve the same folks in the same way without re-traumatizing people in the process. Right? It shouldn't be so hard to get the services that you need. And that's why I love YWCA, but it shouldn't be that hard. So we have a due diligence to build the resilience of the community so that we can continue to build individual resilience in the mind and in the body.
Thank you so much. And, at some point in time, I want to dig in some more about what that community resilience looks like and how that is shaped differently from the individual resilience. And another thing that I just really stood out to me is the notion of adapting in the face of adversity. And I think it's important to center that adapting in the face of adversity. Gender-based violence is just one of the adversities, right, that people go through, particularly with a higher increase on people of color. So while it is important for us to have resilience, and of course it's important for us to adapt, recognizing that you're adapting to one adversity and sometimes you're going to directly to another set of adversities, whether it's your ability to have a job or your ability to afford childcare, right? So for a longer conversation, but the adversities, like when do we get to a point where adversities exist, but they don't need to be a way of life, is what is so meaningful and important to me. Thank you so much. Ayana, the past 2 years, we've seen a compounding amount of trauma across our communities, both nationally and internationally. We've dealt with the COVID pandemic. We've dealt with the economic recession that we also know to be the she-cession, the ongoing police violence and brutality against Black people. We've dealt with the ongoing racist attacks on the AAPI community. We've just dealt with a number of racial justice injustices, and we've also dealt with environmental disasters, right? So when we think about adversities, as we were just talking about, it is one adversity on top of the other, one hill to climb after the other. So how do these traumas further compound the trauma for survivors of color and even more heavily tax their ability to move from a place of surviving to ultimately thriving? Ayana?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have a lot of thoughts around it. So the first thing, or the first word that actually comes to mind when I think about resilience and I think about the COVID pandemic in particular is weathering. I was actually having a conversation with some other folks yesterday about, for Black women, no matter, and really people of color generally, but no matter what class you are, no matter how much wealth you have, no matter how much access and resources you have, you are still a person of color and you are still a woman. And so for Black women, for instance, you're going to deal with misogyny. You're going to deal with anti-Blackness. You're going to deal with misogynoir. And so at all times, you're dealing with these things. Again, it doesn't matter how much money you have. You're still having to battle implicit bias in systems. You're still having to navigate tropes that are labeling you as angry and bitter or strong. And so people don't view you as vulnerable. People don't view you as really needing support or needing help to figure things out. They just assume that, yeah, they'll figure it out. They got it. They'll make their way. And really when COVID first began, I was talking to a lot of elders in my community, and they were telling me like, Ayana, this isn't like, yeah, it's a new name. It's a new virus. It's a new, like whatever illness. But the actual concept of a pandemic, this isn't anything new to us. Like we've been doing this. We've been surviving with limited resources. We've been the ones that have to stay in the hospitals overnight and can't get off. And we're with the janitors. We're the ones cooking the food. We've always been doing these things. again, with little money, with little resources, having to face up against police brutality, having to face up against systems violence, because police brutality is something that's being more heavily documented now and is maybe not now, but more visible, even more visible now. But that's not the only systems violence that folks of color will experience. And so there's a whole new world that's opening up, especially to white allies, where folks are really realizing, hey, I'm seeing this fight, it's right in my face, it's my fight too, and recognizing that. And so I love that we're having a conversation about resiliency, because even when we think about what it's rooted in, resiliency, how it's talked about now, at least, it has a lot more to do with your own individual comfort, or like not wanting to be put in an uncomfortable place to have to listen to people grieve or have to listen to people talk about their woes or their barriers. And so it's much more comfortable to say, hey, you're resilient, you got it, you'll figure it out, you'll make it through, than having to actually deeply and fully connecting with people, especially with people whose experience might not be your own. And so I'll just stop there and open it up to other folks or pass it back to you.
Thank you. And I think one thing that resonated for me when you were speaking, Ayana, is I was just on a panel with the independent sector about where the nonprofit is right now because of COVID and where is it going. And something that was really meaningful for me, in my opinion, is that let's stop acting like these issues, right, that we're facing are new. There is a difference between a pandemic exacerbating what has already been there and creating new issues. So the need for survivors of gender-based violence to be resilient has always been an issue, right? However, with the impact of the pandemic, which has caused a list of other detrimental impacts to communities of color, now it is harder, right, for gender-based violence survivors to actually seek and get the resources that they need to move to a safe space and to create a life where they can thrive. But I really appreciate your family and you just lifting up, like, these things aren't new, right? They're higher in occurrence, but they're not new. Olivia, what would you add to these expectations about resiliency?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's such a fascinating topic. And for me, and it could be that like I've done too much computer work and too much like virtual space, but when I see resilience, I just think of like—
Olivia, I think we're having—
I just think of re-silence. Not sure if y'all can hear me now, but for me, I think of re-silencing survivors and how concerning that can be. We have to remember that overcoming an adverse event is going to look different, right? For every person, for every community, there is no one size fits all model. And I think that's really what we've learned from this pandemic, but also lately, right? So we cannot re-silence survivors as we're coming up with programs and working through systems to try to help others. The other thing, Esperanza United has been very focused on referring to disaster research that show ethnic minority disaster responses, and they're experiencing higher levels of negative psychological outcomes that come from compounding stressors due to social marginalization. So this includes like post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Sadness, feelings of loneliness and stress and just anxiety, and even being in the same environment, right, as like the people that may be causing harm. And so all of that compounding stress can no longer be ignored, right, as other folks have mentioned. Esperanza United has been trying to focus on highlighting the strengths, right, of Hispanic, Latino, Latina communities, and particularly those that have experienced high levels of historical and systematic oppression. So we've been trying to look at solutions on community level, right? And moving away from just an individual perspective on resilience. So we've been trying to find strengths around community organization and action, and that has led to creating more partnerships, trust as we're moving forward out of this pandemic, and also the dual pandemic, right, of sexual assault and domestic violence as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you for the work that you continue to lead, particularly as you bring together the community to continue to address the issues that keep us down, particularly gender-based violence. Carol, you've talked with us before about how important it is to recognize the complexities of these issues and why a DV trauma / social justice framework is so very important for how we show up and how we interact with our community members, and also how we seek the resolutions to the problems that we continue to face. Can you speak more from your perspective about what resilience looks like and the expectations from the clinical perspective?
Thanks, Alicia. And first, I also want to say I'm so honored to be here and with all of you and part of this really important, inspiring conversation. I was actually thinking of talking a little bit from a clinical perspective, but also from a combined integrated advocacy perspective. And part of what I wanted to do is bring a little bit of historical perspective, because when we first started thinking about these issues about how resilience has then become a kind of weaponized against survivors in a way. And from a historical perspective, it was really important to talk about survivors as survivors and to talk about survivors' resilience and strength to counter the more pathologizing approaches that were coming from the mental health field, including the trauma field. So when we started doing this work in 1999, work on this intersection of trauma and domestic violence, acknowledging the mental health and substance use effects is really controversial. And while as advocates, people were really aware of the impact that victimization could have on the emotional well-being of survivors and their children, we were really concerned about how these effects were being used against survivors by their abusive partners and by the systems where they sought help. So just to bring in that layer, and so lack of understanding about domestic violence and how abusive partners can leverage those systems because of the stigma really reduced the likelihood that survivors would have access to safety and resources and support, as well as anything that was truly supportive of healing. It also was a very individualized approach and didn't look at all at social context. So I think just having that perspective is really useful. Also, trauma theory helped shift the ways that we understood mental health, quote unquote, symptoms, and reframe them as survival strategies, as adaptations to potentially life-threatening situations that we make when real protection is unavailable and our usual coping mechanisms are overwhelmed. So it's both the external factors and how that impacts all of us as individuals. And that's why holding all of those together is so critical. Like even you think about PTSD and the kind of constriction and avoidance and hypervigilance, when you walk through the world and you're constantly under siege, whether it's from an abusive partner or from the structural violence and microaggressions, how do I was really glad to hear you talking about this, Bernicia, about we talk about is how do you heal while you're still under siege, right? And so what do we do with that? And most clinicians don't have that perspective at all. They're thinking about trauma that occurred in the past, most trauma treatment modalities for healing from past trauma, and not factoring in what it is to walk through the world when you're dealing with oppression and discrimination and racism and all other kinds of abusive and oppressive experiences. So, part of our thinking was that when service providers had a greater appreciation of survivors' resilience and strength and survivor skills, they're more likely to respond in ways that are empathic and non-judgmental, and actually seeing people as whole people, because our growing edges are, who we are and our strengths and our connections. And so being able to connect with people around that is really critical to create the space that allows us to look at be more vulnerable. When you think about when we can actually connect with someone, it's when we feel safe, when we don't feel judged, when there's resonance, like, even whether we're conscious of it or not, where we feel like we can be whole, including all the things that are painful to us. And so I think understanding how to create that space is really critical. The other thing is, one of the ways we think about it is like the traumatic effects of abuse and ongoing coercive control, and the traumatic legacies of historical trauma, which isn't really historical, and structural violence, and the policies that support that and continue to perpetuate it. So it's like our version of a trauma social justice approach is, recognizing the pervasiveness of both individual and collective trauma, mitigating the harms, supporting and facilitating healing, recognizing the impact on all of us so that we can be fully present, which is a huge piece of being able to do this work and stay connected, and then transforming the conditions that perpetuate abuse and violence and generate trauma in our lives and our world. And so thinking about that and what it means to create resilient communities where it's, one of the things I learned this from my dear friend and colleague, Gwendolyn Packard, who's at the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. When you're thinking about if everyone in a community has an average childhood experience score of 8 or 10, the problem is not individual, it's collective, and the solutions have to be collective as well. I mean, your center of gravity isn't just about yourself, but your own well-being is tied to the well-being of your family and your community. Then we have to have solutions that address that. When everyone's a relative, then we're all in this together. So I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much, Carol. I hear a lot of trends in your responses as we think about what we've learned from the previous panelists. The notion that we need to center community as we think about healing. Also, that you called it the constant under siege, and I think Venetia referred to the adapting to adversity, right? So I think that there are, regardless of where we sit on the, did you want to say something else, Carol? Did your hand go up?
Yeah, I just want to add, it's like adapting to adversity, but adapting to social injustice. So it's always like one of the things we learned about quote unquote perpetrator accountability is also systems accountability. And so holding that as part of our framework. So just want to add that.
No, that is right. The adversity that we face as a community definitely is not made by our own volitions and doing. They're deeply rooted in the systemic barriers and how the system is built. It's not really built to allow a certain population of folks to survive, people of color, and to thrive. So you're absolutely correct. So thank you for just lifting up your perspective and also making sure that we can see the themes in the clinical approach to the work that we all do respectively. Erin, you are on the ground. You are at one of our amazing associations, YWCA Billings in Montana. And you deal directly with our communities that need us the most and need our support the most. So I am so glad that you are here and a part of the conversation. I think that I'm going to ask a question that is really near and dear to our mission and who we are as an organization. And from your vantage point, what do we need to do to understand and lift up survivors' resiliency, particularly as we've heard from our esteemed panelists that the resiliency is a resiliency not only that is brought on by gender-based violence, but the other systemic barriers that we continue to face as a community. Erin?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And I really want to highlight some things that this brings up for me. And one of those is working in rural Montana near many tribal nations, and knowing that part of the oppression of American Indian people is assuming that because they're more vulnerable to violence and they experience it more often, that they're not resilient. And I think that's something that those of us that have privilege have used to continue to keep that population and people that are experiencing violence oppressed or out of the mainstream conversation. And I think in ways has led to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people, that we have silenced them. We have assumed that the violence that they experience is their fault, or that they are somehow less than. And I'm really reminding myself that just because somebody maybe isn't appearing what we would typically call resilient, or they're experiencing that harm and they're struggling through that, that doesn't mean that they're not resilient. It's that they're being authentic and reaching out to us for help. And I would like to remember to lift up and highlight how survivors are resilient and how they're overcoming all of the different intersectionalities that we've talked about and the other ladies have brought up, and just making sure that we're aware. And for those of us with privilege to sort of take a step back and recognize that and make sure that, what we're doing is being the best support system that we can and not contributing more to the oppression or the negative experiences and the trauma that survivors are experiencing.
Thank you so much, Monica. Erin, and thank you for centering thank you for centering the work that you guys do so gracefully in Montana, particularly a state that is largely rural and the home of 12 tribal nations. So thank you for being a part of our community and centering Native Americans. Thank you. Monica, we know, and we talked a little bit here, and from a lot of your work about the systemic inequities, right? We've heard of, in this conversation, adversities. We've heard about the constantly under siege folks, marginalized communities. And we know that these are all because of the systemic inequities that continue to linger on an individual and a collective basis as we think about trauma. And so for survivors of color, the weight of gender-based violence is compounded by the experiences of the historical trauma and current day racialized violence. How can we reframe our understanding of resilience to account for the additional layers of historical trauma that our communities have to face?
Yeah. Thank you all for having me. And just to, add to what our panelists have already, so eloquently mentioned, in the conversation of historical trauma and current day racial violence and the intersectionality of gender-based violence, it's important to talk about the collective gender-based violence, as was already said, and not just talk about domestic violence or sexual violence as if they're isolated, because it is collective. And it is, as we've heard, compounded based on historical, experiences that our survivors have gone through. And so at our organization, we've spoken to survivors across the country, and they detailed a lot of the abuses that they had been exposed to before even seeking services. So, it wasn't a one-time thing where suddenly, they were faced in a domestic violence situation and then they rush and seek services. It's very, lifespan. And I think that that's really something that I wanted to highlight. And there is a range and there's stages of abuse over lifetime violence can occur. There's the historical trauma that we've already discussed. We've spent some time talking about that, which includes family trauma, racial trauma, that our families have, suffered through in our communities, hearing about, what our, ancestors have been through. That also impacts how you react. And then also, I don't want to forget our Pacific Islander communities where colonization and militarization is still part of their historical trauma today. And, it's important to lift that up as well. And, there's also different types of abuses that girls and women are vulnerable to. So for example, we still see rape as a tool of war, internationally, even, domestically, and that needs to be lifted up. And there are different perpetrators across the life course of any survivor. It can range from incest to a coach in school to then a pimp who is trafficking someone, and then to domestic violence and intimate partner violence situations as well. And so while, the perpetrators throughout a lifespan may become different, it's all part of the historical trauma that our survivor has, been through. And finally, like Vernisha mentioned, we're constantly healing, and these histories of abuse do affect survivors seeking help. So for example, in the AAPI community, immigrant community, or in the Black community, the current race inequity that we are seeing right now for these communities impact whether a survivor will seek help from law enforcement or from systems. And that needs to be said, because if in the past, a survivor goes to law enforcement and nothing was done, or instead, if a perpetrator was listened to rather than, the one seeking help, that will impact future help seeking. And, if a mom, if someone, if a child tells their mom what happened and the mom, or community doesn't listen, that will impact negatively whether or not a survivor will seek help. So that also is very important. And you had mentioned, what are ways of community healing? We're seeing a lot of that happen in the AAPI community. And I think it's different than just, going, to court. It's healing circles. We've been seeing healing circles with the communities and families, planting a garden with children, having food and tea, and really, sitting on the land that, has, where some of the violence occurred, and healing through that. I think those, creative ways and are different ways of healing that we may not necessarily think of when, we talk about healing from gender-based violence. And that is why, because there is no one size fits all approach. I think you've heard that time and time again from all the presenters. That is why we need to reframe our understanding of resilience, because as you can see, it is quite complex.
Absolutely, Monica, and thank you for that. And I want to thank you for also bringing the police, the group that is there to protect folks that are experiencing gender-based violence into the conversation. I've seen throughout the years at YWCA the intentionality of local associations to partner with the police departments in their community to provide the necessary training that they need as they show up and try to help in these gender-based violence situations. So I just want to lift up the partnerships that I think are really, really important to our communities, the partnerships with the police department, because they happen to be the folks that show up first when a call is made. So making sure that they are aware that they have the training and the resources to adequately and effectively control or get the situation under control and provide the necessary next steps for victims, I think is really important. And I just want to acknowledge all the local associations across the country that have taken that step to partner with law enforcement to make sure that they're also providing the best support to gender-based violence survivors when they show up after they receive a call. This section of our panel discussion is going to be more of a popcorn round. I'm going to ask a question, and then I'm going to throw it to Olivia first to respond. And then after Olivia, we can then go to Carol and then Monica. We've heard a lot in this conversation about our collective work with survivors that we can overemphasize sometimes as service providers and as the general community, the emphasis on resilience, and place the responsibility on those individual survivors to heal and maintain their own physical health. And in the process, absolve organizations and also society, including the police departments and other members of society, absorb them of the responsibility to participate in the process of keeping our communities safe. And for many reasons, making structural changes that are necessary to decrease the level of trauma of survivors is something that we continue to collectively, not only at the YWCA, but each of you continue to do collectively. So we know that trauma-informed care is really important, and we're getting a greater understanding of trauma-informed care. We know that adverse childhood experience is also really important to center that in our work. We know that the root sources of trauma can be open, like you said, Monica, to different pathways, not only gender-based violence. So my question, Olivia, is, what are the specific systematic changes in policy and also in practice? Because we know they need to go hand in hand, that we need to prioritize and pursue to better support survivors and prevent gender-based violence.
It's such a great question. And it actually leads me to, as Monica was speaking, I was like, we need to also mention, right, systems and how they become tools, right, of those causing harm. And so we need to be mindful of that as we try to restructure and think about policy and policy advocacy and systems change, right? So one of the things that we really enjoy doing is working with the YWCA on policies like the Violence Against Women Act, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act mentioned, right, FIPSA, and those need to be passed, right? And what those pieces of legislation have in them is supporting communities and survivors that have been repeatedly marginalized, both by abusers, but also by systems that continue to isolate and traumatize, right, survivors, families, and communities. So I'm going to give you a quick example, and this came to mind as Monica was speaking. We know that within the immigration system, that abusers or people that cause harm will threaten to call ICE and have the victim detained or deported, right? They'll use the ICE anonymous tip line or something of that nature. And so then the system becomes a tool of abuse. So something else that we can think about as Monica was talking about, first responders, right, who need to believe survivors that kind of first contact. We could think about language access that needs to be built into existing systems as well, because the manipulation of systems cannot be a tool of those that continue to perpetuate harm.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Carol? Carol, I think you're muted.
I was. So it felt great to be able to build on what everyone else has been, what all of you have been saying, because it's all been so important and inspiring. I was going to touch on one thing around trauma-informed services, and trauma-informed is so limited. It's really human-informed and people in the context of their whole lives and communities and everything that they're experiencing. But one small piece is when we understand trauma responses as adaptations to being under siege, then part of our work is to do everything we can to reduce the likelihood that survivors will feel discounted or disempowered in our programs and systems. So it's like, I think of it as the antidote to abuse on the personal level and oppression on the collective level. But thinking more broadly, we're excited that Congress has recommended that HHS create state-level pilot program to incentivize substance use disorder treatment providers to be trained on intimate partner violence and to create integrated state-level responses because substance use is one of the primary reasons for child removal by Child Protective Service, and this disproportionately impacts communities of color, Indigenous communities, Black community. And so it's this nexus of punitive social policies, abusive leverage, and stigma, and to be able to mobilize systems to really look at that together would be really critical, same as people being afraid to call the police because who's going to be literally left holding the bag. So thinking about all, for women who are incarcerated, substance use is also a critical issue, disproportionately impacts communities of color, and substance use coercion plays a big role. So it's like adding in all of the layers of what we experience, not just the traumatic effects. So when you look at what kind of, I'm thinking of Stephanie Covington's work on what reduces recidivism, quote unquote, for women who've experienced substance use or who've been incarcerated. If they had all the resources on the front end, they wouldn't have ended up in that system if those systems weren't also looking to criminalize substance use and discriminate against communities of color. I mean, so it's like all of that together that needs to be part of our policy agenda. FIPSA reauthorization also is including mental health and substance use in its definition of health services. But some of the things that are really critical are making sure that people have access to services like good mental health, substance use healing services, but not just access that's safe, access that's culturally responsive, access that is gender responsive, gender inclusive, DV informed, and 2-generation. And it's like all the things that you want and aren't necessarily system-based, but also that there's an investment in community-based solutions. So there's the looking at things that what do we invest in? And in thinking about this conversation today, I was thinking about we should have like a group of policy analysis that's looking at any policy proposals, who benefits, who's harmed, and what do we have to say about that, and where should investments be made, and doing that across sectors. And I think because of what's happened in the last year, including around police brutality and COVID, that's kind of stripped away the veils of things that we've known for years. There's much more opportunity to do cross-sector work, and I think we should take advantage of that while we can.
Thank you so much, Carol. Monica, I'll throw it to you to end this round two of our panel discussion. But before I do, I just also want to center childcare, right? When we think about the policies and the access that we need to address within this country to really actually get on a path to ending gender-based violence and so many other issues that we continue to face, I oftentimes go back to childcare. I oftentimes go back to what would life look like, particularly, and I'll speak from my personal experience, like what would my life look like if my mom had affordable childcare and I was not out there looking for love in all the wrong places, right? So I think that I know that centering access to affordable childcare as part of the immediate policies and offerings from the government will go a really long way in trying to lift up and support the communities that are so near and dear to us. So with that, I will pass it on to Monica. Monica, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that you mentioned childcare because for survivors, caring for their children, and providing for their children means working, right? And if you can't work, if you have to, be home and take care of your children because there isn't affordable childcare, then it really puts a survivor 10 steps back, in moving forward, in their life. And so in addition to childcare, our systems are set up to help survivors of gender-based violence, but they can also be a wall, as Olivia mentioned, if the policies and regulations are not helpful to the reality of the situation that a survivor is in. Doing direct services for 22 years, I have always seen policies, well-meaning policies, but the reality of those policies not hitting home and not reflecting what survivors are going through and seeing real adversity and, hearing that, oh, there's a policy there to help, but not really helping frustrates the situation completely. So for example, with immigration laws, the processing time of immigration applications for survivors of gender-based violence is almost a decade. That is way too long to ask for a survivor to even manage further for another decade what they are already going through. The requirement to work with law enforcement, as we mentioned, the lack of language access when working with law enforcement or court systems, not being allowed to work or drive, like I mentioned. It puts survivors in more dangerous situations where they cannot heal or take the step forwards towards resiliency. Also, state practice does not always follow federal laws. Coming from Georgia, our laws do not follow, many federal, laws. And so you have to understand statewide what's going on, for survivors. And then, that's the gap that needs to be recognized and responded to. And finally, here I am complaining about the policies, but what do I recommend? And in working with YWCA and many of the partners who are on the panel today, there needs to be an understanding of the complexity of situations that gender-based violence survivors face, and that needs to be reflected in policy. VAWA and other laws need to include humanitarian exemptions or concessions to reflect what is happening on the ground for survivors. And having survivors jump through hoops for protections is what our future policies need to avoid. And of course, I won't go into it, but if you were to even add historical trauma that we, spoke of before in the segment before, you're really creating even more barriers for, healing for survivors.
Whew, there's so much, right? Aaron, I see you with your hands up, sorry. So I'm going to open it to see if Aaron, I'll let you take the floor first, but Ayana or Venetia, if there is anything that you wish to share, I just think that this question is so important. I definitely don't want to leave this space without getting your input if you have any. Aaron?
Thank you. I really want to also think about speaking, I guess, to those sisters on the call today that are doing the work, that there's something to be said about federal policy and state policy, but I really also want people to think about policies in their own organization and policies around providing services and making sure that we're providing survivor-centered services and that we're not creating policies that make access to services harder or creating policies where as a survivor, as a service provider, that we're believing that we are healing the survivors. The survivors are healing themselves. We are walking alongside them and helping them to find what they have in them, to bring it out and to shine and be their full authentic self and live their best life. And so really, taking that step back and assessing what your policies are in your organization and, in your shelter, if you offer one, and figuring out how you take survivor feedback and center survivors in those policies. And so you're not doing more harm than good.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Venetia or Ayana, anything to add?
Yeah, so I mean, this conversation could go on for days, I feel, but one thing that was coming up when I know definitely when Carol spoke, when Monica, when Aaron spoke about community and collective trauma and generational trauma even, that I'm thinking about how for the Black community historically, there really haven't been, and I mean, again, people of color historically, but for the Black community, there really haven't been outlets to talk about our pain and our trauma. So of course we didn't talk about mental health. Of course we didn't talk about trauma. Of course we didn't elevate those things, not because we didn't actually care about them, but because, even thinking about historically, there are a lot of implications for what would happen if you even talked about your pain or you talked about what was happening with you. Like if you were raped by the slave master, what are you gonna do? Like you're gonna cry and tell who? Like who's gonna do something about it? When you burn your food in your house and your husband beat you, where are you going to go when you aren't able to open a bank account because you're a woman? Like there's so many historical pieces that add context to why survivors, of course, are gonna show up as resilient because they've been forced to be. And then it's especially important though to recognize that, and then to also recognize again, just what Aaron was saying, what's happening in programs. Because if you have a survivor come in, you tell them, yes, you're resilient. I want you to be resilient. I want you to get all the resources you need, and then are upset because they're self-advocating. Like those two points don't really go together. And so what are we really telling survivors where we're not understanding their trauma? So even again, with Black women expressing trauma symptoms, if you don't recognize it as trauma, you're feeding into implicit bias, you're feeding into stereotypes, you're not going to see fawning as fawning. You're going to see it as, oh, well, you're a strong Black woman. Why didn't you fight back? Or, oh, I probably don't believe that story. You're not going to see dissociation as dissociation. You're going to see it as, oh, she has an attitude, she has attachment problems, she doesn't really care about her kids, so we need to call CPS. And I've seen those things like quickly snowball in my work, in this work. And so to, again, recognize systems gaps, systems barriers, systems violence as part of how this resilience image has been crafted. And then what can we actually do to support people in being resilient? Like that's another layer to the conversation that we really need to start delving into. But I'm gonna pass it to my girl, Bernicia.
Well, Alicia, do we have time for me to add here, or do we?
We have a little bit of time. We're over, but I'm definitely going to extend some privilege and center your voice as well, because I think it's important.
Thank you for that. I will be very brief. I think that just going back to, well, I'll say this. There are survivors, and then there are it's a huge number of those who are still surviving. And I think that it's also very, very important for us when we're looking at policy, programs, procedures, to also figure out what interventions can be made for those who are actually causing the harm, for those who are actually inciting the domestic violence. Because we can only do so much, right? But if that trauma, if that abuse continues to follow us and keep coming back, it literally puts all the weight and the responsibility to heal and to thrive on the person that's not even causing the harm to themselves. So I challenge all organizations, entities, agencies, if you really want to help those of us who have survived and those who are still surviving, that interventions also need to be placed on those who are causing the harm and participating in violent behavior.
Whew. That was a whole entire word. And it leads me right into very nicely. So you're going to have to think about one more thing, Kanisha, which is my last question for the group. This has been such an amazing conversation. And like Ayana said, we can talk about this forever because there's so much work to do. There's so much intentionality that we need to place our actions behind our words, our resources behind our intent to actually drive the change that we want to see, not only for survivors, but for those that are still in gender-based violence situations and those that, to Kanisha's point, are trying to move towards the survival and the survivor in each of us. So with that, I'll give each of you 30 seconds to just share one thing that you would hope or you wish that we would take away from this moment to normalize in our actions, our behaviors, and in our work. I'll start with Monica.
Yeah, thank you. So in closing, I would just like to say, at API-GBV, we hold listening sessions where we hear, what's happening on the ground. And we recently did one with the Pacific Island community where a 77-year-old woman mentioned, I am 77 years old and I am a survivor and I'm still healing. And, I've heard from a 90-year-old woman, from the, Comfort Women, tragedy, back during World War II, who said, I am still healing. And so the healing never ends. And I think you've heard that over and over again during this panel, but just to put that into context, you never forget, you move on, but the healing is always, progressing and happening every single day.
Thank you, Monica. Carol?
I'm just thinking about how to hold the complexities of all the different levels of how abuse and trauma play out in social, individual, and political forms, and how do we hold that, and how do we think about what transforms that? And to think one way we think about it is how do we embody in our lives and work the world that we want to create, and how do we think about doing that together in less siloed ways?
Thank you so much, Carol. Kanisha? Bernicia.
Yeah, it's okay. I actually want to just take the time to speak directly to those of us who have survived and those who are still surviving. And I just want to say that the trauma you have experienced does not define your future and the rest of your life. I also want to say that your feelings are real, have been real, even for that person that has harmed you. There's no shame in what you have felt. And I want you to give yourself grace and that you have survived your worst days, and to survive the next set of days and the next set of years. I want you to tap into what helped you survive those worst days and double down on that, because the world needs you, and those who have tried to keep you down know how much the world needs you. And I just want you to know that your life is more valuable than anything else that you've experienced or what you have been told that's been negative.
Kanisha, is it that you're trying to make us cry? Okay, just checking. Ayana, thank you so much for that. Ayana?
Yeah, the one takeaway that I think I would have is stop punishing survivors for surviving. Let people show up in whatever way and however they want. And so if someone wants to come in and yell and scream and talk about their trauma, like, let them do it, and then talk to them more and maybe see if there's a different way you can communicate later, or see if there's different ways that they can be creative in their expression. Again, don't, like Olivia was just saying, like, let's not re-silence people. Let's really tap into what folks are trying to share, even if it's painful for us, but give folks that space and grace.
Okay, thank you so much, Ayana. Aaron.
I actually just really want to echo what you said, Ayana, about, for me, I want to keep having this conversation. And as hard as it can be sometimes when you think you're doing good work, I want to hear the ways that we're not doing it right and the ways that we've caused harm unintentionally so that we can do better. I think everybody in this field is here because we're deeply passionate about it. And I'm so glad that we're starting to open up and talk about the ways that, you know, harm has been caused in the past. And I just really want to say, we want to hear that, and let's keep having this conversation and figure out how we can do better in the future.
Thank you, Aaron. Olivia.
Thanks so much. You know, as a survivor, for me, it was really helpful to think about that one person who took the time to listen and believe me. And so I really try to find the time and the space to be supportive to other people who are going through trauma. And we can't expect people to pick up themselves when they're experiencing compounding events, right? So we all just kind of listen and support one another. I think we'd all make this world a better place.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our amazing esteemed panelists for coming on our town hall today, being vulnerable, being honest, being transparent, but also being extremely supportive to survivors and folks that are currently experiencing gender-based violence. This is not an easy conversation. There is a lot of work that we need to do collectively as a community. The one thing that no one asked me, but I'll just share the one thing that I'm going to take away from this conversation, and I hope that we do, is something that a number of you said, you know, how is it that we can better support survivors in a way that they still maintain their humanity, they still maintain their pride and their independence. We've all been through a lot, and asking for help is not an easy thing. So raising your hand and saying, I need help, is further detrimental to how we feel that we're showing up, and it adds to the shame. So being in spaces where we're not victimized again because of the experiences that we have. One thing that I absolutely love about the YWCA is that when we are part of communities and we are in communities, we're in there to partner with communities to get to where they want to be, to a place where they can thrive, and not in communities just aimlessly trying to be a savior, but partnering with those communities, which means listening to what they want and what they need because they know best, and then going out and finding the resources that they don't necessarily have access to. The last thing that I'll say is really important to this conversation is the humanity piece, the piece that is about community. We are all human. And we all try to live and operate in a system that for many of us, particularly people of color, the system was not designed to support our needs, support us, or put us in a position where we can thrive. But at the end of the day, we are all human. And as long as we can continue to stay together and continue these conversations, continue to forge towards what solutions look like that don't perpetuate harm, I think that we will be better off as a community. So with that, I'm going to introduce the song from India Irie. It's called Humanity. I think that it was very timely, and it is very timely because it's important that we center the fact that we are one human race and that we all need access to resources in an equitable way. And regardless of what our struggles are, it does not define who we are or how we show up, and we all should be loved accordingly. So with that, thank you so much to the panelists and India Irie. Here we go.
I want to close with this, my prayer for humanity. That we can learn what it means to really love ourselves. That we can learn to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. That we can live in harmony, see ourselves as a family. This is my prayer for humanity. That we respect our women and protect our girls. That they feel safe in every corner of the world. That we can live in harmony, see ourselves as a family. This is my prayer for humanity. That every man will be a father to someone by loving every boy as if it were his only son. That we can live in harmony, see ourselves as a family. This is my prayer. This is my prayer for humanity. That we know that nobody really wins a war, and every leader knows what power is really for. That we can live in harmony, see ourselves as a family. This is my prayer. This is our prayer. This is our prayer. This is our prayer for humanity. Words all across the world. That every man, woman, boy, and girl will hear these words all across the world. That every man, woman, boy, and girl will hear these words all across the world. This is my prayer. This is my prayer for humanity. I am India Arie. It is my pleasure to be with you. It is my affirmation for all of us that we are worthy and we're significant and we matter because we exist. Until next time, all my love. Peace.
Thank you so much, NDRE. That was just a phenomenal way to end our panel discussion. And at this point in time, I am incredibly excited to transition over to a brief awards ceremony with a number of our YWCAs. As many of you may know, YWCA as a national entity is the largest network of domestic and sexual violence service providers in the United States. And in 2020, we created a COVID-19 relief fund to support our YWCA network. The fact that we had 50 applications for emergency funding just this fall is a testament to how deeply COVID-19 has impacted our network's ability to meet the scale and scope of need in communities, because the data is really clear that there's a perfect storm of factors that have increased domestic violence safety issues and the demand for our services. What I'm really excited to be able to share with everyone who's here today is that we are announcing $180,000 in grants to the YWCAs in Clark County, Washington, Missoula, Montana, Springfield, Massachusetts, and Bristol, Tennessee. And this money is specifically intended to help them meet the escalating needs from domestic violence survivors in their communities. And I'm really pleased right now to be able to have a representative from each of these YWCAs to spend a minute or two sharing with us how this grant money is going to help them support survivors of gender-based violence in their communities. So I'm going to start with Danechka, if I could call on you from the YWCA of Clark County.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I am Danechka Otero Serrano, proud Puerto Rican woman, pronounced as she, her, ella. And I am the newest executive director at YWCA Clark County. And through this YWCA, we serve about 13,000 people every year. For those that don't know where Clark County is, we are the most southern county of Washington State. We border Portland, Oregon. This is a very white community with about only 2% of the population being Black. I'm saying this because in the last 24 months, we had 7 deaths of shooting by our local sheriff department. And this is more than alarming. And to addition, we, like any other coastal city, we have a crisis of housing. Those two together are putting our women more vulnerable than ever in fear of law enforcement's protection. There is a lot of fear of that, and becoming houseless. So in light of all of this and the reality that we're living with COVID, I want to thank YWCA National for this grant of $45,000 for Safe Choice Emergency Financial Assistance. It's being used tremendously well to bring housing, basic needs, relocation assistance, and anything they need to stay safe in this time. So thank you again. It also makes the world for our team to be able to support their clients.
All righty, and next, thank you so much, Danechka. I'm really excited to have Julie from YWCA Missoula join us. Julie?
Hi, I'm Julie Maturin from YWCA Missoula. I'm the development director. I've been at YWCA Missoula for 20 years now, so I've seen a lot of changes happen here. But YWCA Missoula's Pathways program provides safe, confidential shelter, crisis counseling, and personal advocacy for women, children, and men experiencing domestic and/or sexual violence. We moved into our new facility, the Meadowlark, in April of this year, where we have doubled our capacity to shelter survivors. And along with a wide array of supportive services all under one roof now. And these services include clinical counseling, children's programming, a legal clinic, access to basic dental and medical care. We mainly serve low-income women and their children. However, we are now able to serve male survivors on site as well. Members of the BIPOC community represent a larger portion of our clients than in the general population. Approximately 25% of our clients are Native Americans, which is a striking discrepancy with a 2.7% Native American residing in Missoula County. And like many states, Montana is experiencing a spike in COVID-19 cases fueled by the Delta variant. In fact, Missoula and Montana have the highest rates of positive cases, hospitalizations, and deaths since the beginning of the pandemic. And Montana currently has the highest rate in the nation. So YWCA Missoula is seeing an increase in the number of survivors needing safe shelter and a concurrent increase in the amount of time required in shelter due to the acute housing crisis. Missoula has experienced an influx of people moving from across the country who can work remotely and had considered Montana a safe respite. Rent increases and low vacancy rates create significant barriers to survivors to achieve stable housing, which extends their time in shelter. The YWCA Week Without Violence COVID-19 relief funds will be a vital help for us to serve our clients. We are going to use the funds to provide increased services to survivors and their families while they're isolated in their rooms, including food, phones, weekend care, among other things. If the shelter is full, we can provide hotel rooms to quarantine until we can serve them on site. These same quarantine requirements are causing staffing shortages, and the grant will allow us to pay overtime to staff members that need to pick up open shifts. And we will use a portion of the funds to help alleviate barriers to housing by helping with security deposits, first and last month's rent, and to mitigate other rental barriers such as paying overdue past bills. So we are so grateful for the support, and we are so happy to be able to serve our clients even better. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. It's great to hear what you're going to be doing and the difference that this is going to make. I'd like to turn now to Liz Deneen from YWCA of Western Massachusetts. Liz?
Thank you, Catherine. I just want to start off by saying the word gratitude. Gratitude, gratitude. That's how I feel. Thank you very much, YWCA, USA. You guys have been incredibly supportive throughout the pandemic at every step of the way by offering much needed information at vital times throughout the pandemic. You have a tremendous team, and we are filled with gratitude toward you, toward this grant, toward the leadership. We intend to use this money to make some renovations within our domestic violence shelter, and also to increase the quality of life within the shelter by giving each one of the residents' rooms a little refrigerator and an iPad. So it's just little things like that that can make things so much easier every day. So again, I'm ending with gratitude. Thank you for everything.
Thanks, Liz. And Megan Parks from YWCA of Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Parks, and I'm the program coordinator for the YWCA's Young Adult Victim Advocacy Program out of the YWCA of Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. Our team focuses primarily on the needs of young adult victims of crime, ages 17 to 24, who have experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking or harassment, dating violence, cybercrime, you name it, we serve it here. Our program also works to fill the gaps in crisis community response for all victims of domestic violence, regardless of age, every evening, weekend, and holiday, to ensure no victim falls through the cracks. It's the mission of the YW Cares program to uplift victims of crime through compassionate, individualized support by providing advocacy, education, and empowerment. On behalf of the YWCA Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, I would like to express my gratitude to the YWCA USA for choosing our organization for this amazing honor. It is truly a testament to the team at our local YWCA for the extensive hours, sweat, and yes, at times tears that are contributed daily to the mission of ending gender-based violence in our corner of Appalachia. This funding opportunity will not only allow our team to serve more victims who are currently fleeing violence, but also provide us the opportunity to improve upon the existing service provision in our area in light of recent economic challenges due to COVID-19. This funding allows our advocates to receive assistance on our 24/7 crisis hotline, to provide food, clothing, essential needs to those who are fleeing unsafe locations, and to provide needed assistance for transitional housing or emergency shelter for those who call us where they have nowhere else to go. This funding provides hope, it provides opportunity, and most of all, it provides empowerment that our clients, possibly for the first time, can see the light at the end of the tunnel, that they can wake up in the morning feeling safe in their own space and have an advocate they can call to help meet their needs. This funding is life-changing, not only to our victim advocates, but those who are fighting for their lives each passing day. The team at the YWCA Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia are honored to be chosen for this incredible opportunity. We recognize how many amazing organizations applied for this funding, and we're truly honored to be found worthy of this gift. So thank you from myself, from the YWCA Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, and for all the people that we're serving in our community.
Look at that. It would be nice if I unmuted. So I want to just thank Catherine for leading that part of the of our town hall, and I want to especially thank all of our local associations. Special thanks for the work that you guys do, particularly the ones that have been honored today, but just all in all of the work that each and every single one of you do every single day in your communities and at your associations. What we know at YWCA USA is that we will not be, and we would not be YWCA USA without each and every single one of your associations and the commitment and the work that you do for your communities. So because you are strong, we are strong, we need each other. Reciprocity is the name of the game, and I am so grateful to be a part of a community that really centers the needs for the people that need us the most, our communities that are oftentimes unheard. So thank you to every single association. I want to thank all of the panelists again for showing up and just speaking from a really authentic place on what the need is to relax our expectations on resiliency for survivors. And in this moment in time, I'm also going to say we should relax our resiliency on all people of color, particularly Black people. Resiliency is a great skill to have, but it by no means mean that that is how we should live our days every single day. So as we continue to reimagine what resiliency looks like and what it means for us in our work, I just absolutely have to end my part just thanking and lifting up the amazing team that we call YWCA. What we will call the small and mighty team. Know that every single one of the staff members at YWCA USA continue to get up and turn over every stone to make sure that you get everything that you need that is within our power to show up for your communities. I know that we may not be there with you on the ground, but we are there in other ways, and we are working really hard to increase our support of local associations so that you can increase your support of your communities. To a special thank you to the amazing Week Without Violence team led by Caitlin Laurie, Catherine Bean, also Yolanda Rain. And I can call each of the names on the committee, but I'm probably going to mess it up. So I'm just going to say thank you to the entire committee, the senior team, all staff. You guys are super amazing. And thank you to our board of directors for allowing us just to be our best professional selves and show up for you and supporting us as we show up for you to continue the hard work that we know is really important. Thank you all. I think that there is a call to action that Catherine built in to the flow. And I would say the call to action, local associations, you guys know the call to action in your communities better than we do. But our call to action really is that you lock into reaching out to your congresswomen or men, making sure that you lock into our quorum software that is on our ywca.org website so you all can get the information on how to call your members of Congress to advocate for better policies and more resources for your community. There will be several calls to actions from the state advocacy perspective. Continue to be a part of our Week Without Violence activities. Tomorrow is Feel Good Fridays. Please do something that feels good. And on Saturday, it's also a day of rest. So I hope that you all get some rest. And Tri-County, special shout out to you and the block party that you're having on Saturday. I cannot wait to see the amazing mural that you guys have been working on. So thank you all and have an amazing day.